As Luke was getting a little bit older and was kind of learning the idea or the perspective of distance or size of things, we would have this thing where we would start telling each other how much we loved each other. And so he would say to me something like, "Well, Dad, I love you as big as the backyard." And then I would say, well, I love you big as the backyard and the front yard, right? And so we'd kind of grow it a little bit. And he said, well, I love you as big as the street. And it would grow from there, and then, he'd say, I'd love you all the way to school and back. And then it was all the way to Grandma's house and back, and then all the way to Grandma's old house and back, which was even farther away. And then it would grow, and then eventually it would get to, I love you to the moon and back. And I'd say, well, I love you to the moon and back 10 times. And then Luke said, well, I love you bigger than Walmart. I thought, well, that's pretty good. He thinks that Walmart is bigger than 10 times the moon and back, which my science teacher's here, and that's not true, Mr. Roach. I taught him immediately that he needs to know his science better than that. But anyway, and so it's all about perspective, right? I mean, to Luke, the biggest place he had been was Walmart, and they are pretty big. I had to recently go back to my high school. Anybody had that experience? You graduate and you go back like 10 or 15 years later, go back to your high school? I did, and when I walked in, it was much smaller than I remembered it. As a kid in school, everything's so big, the hallways are so tall and so long, and now I go back as an adult and I'm thinking, man, this place is not as big as I thought it was. And the reason for that, it's about perspective. Your perspective has changed. That's the thing with Luke. The reason that Luke thought Walmart was bigger than the moon and back was because he doesn't have any perspective realistically about how far the moon is. He can see it in the sky, but Walmart is just so big. And my hope and prayer today is that today's message will be a perspective changer for you. Because many of us, we kind of go through life and we tackle this issue that we've been talking about now for a few weeks, this issue of forgiveness, and we have a certain perspective about forgiveness. And it comes up in lots of different ways, and so we have rules about forgiveness. We say, well, these are the things that I will forgive, but these are the things that I will not forgive, But then somebody over here, their perspective is a little different, and maybe some of the things that you wouldn't be willing to forgive, they're easily able to forgive, So a lot of it is about perspective, and so we go through life and we say things like, well, here's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is burying the hatchet. You ever heard that? You just kind of bury it, and then you leave it there and you walk away. And some of us will say, well, forgiveness, is forgive and forget. You just forgive and then you forget it. But how many of you have forgiven something but you still remember the offense? All of us do. Right? And so we have these different perspectives about forgiveness, and our perspective really skews the way that we think about things. I know people that feel like, I must not have forgiven this person because I still remember what happened. I can't forget what they did. So does that mean that I haven't forgiven them? And I really hope that today's message will be a perspective changer for you, where you don't think Walmart is bigger than to the moon and back 10 times. You see what I'm saying? So if you have your Bible, I want you to open it to Genesis chapter 50. If you have it on your phone, just bring it up. If not, don't worry, the verses will be up here on the screen. But I want us to actually today journey back. This is the final message in our series on forgiveness, and I want us to actually journey back to where it began. And I think that's appropriate because here's the thing about forgiveness. An offense will happen in your life, and maybe it takes a little bit of time. Maybe in the moment you're able to forgive it, but you're going to find yourself down the road and you're going to journey back to the source of that hurt. You're going to hear something that's going to remind you of that offense. Or you're going to feel something that reminds you of the way that you felt when that offense first happened. Sometimes it'll be something you smell. You might smell someone's perfume, and immediately that will take you right back to that moment where the offense happened. And so we're going to actually today go back to where it started. And I think that's appropriate because many times with forgiveness, you're going to find yourself there. You're going to find yourself back in the pit. You're going to find yourself back in a place where you will feel again all the emotions and the feelings that you felt just like it was yesterday. So we're going to go back and study the story of Joseph's life today. Now, some of you, I know you're here to visit your mom on Mother's Day. Thank you so much for being here. We're so delighted that you're here. Some of you have missed some of the messages in the forgiveness series, and that's okay. So let me take you back to what we've covered so far, and this will be really brief, okay? But we're going to look at the story of a man named Joseph. And I think we have a timeline. Is that correct? I want to look at this. So when Joseph was 17 years old, When he was 17 years old, he had some dreams. His dad thought that Joseph was the favorite, gave him a coat of many colors, and Joseph had a couple of dreams. And in those dreams, basically, the message of it was, there's going to be a day, brothers. He had 11 brothers. He said, there's going to be a day when you're actually going to come and bow down to me. And his brothers were enraged by jealousy, and they called him the dreamer. And so at age 17, his brothers decided they were going to kill him. You talk about sibling rivalry. I mean, this takes it to another level. So Ryan and Michael are over here kind of eyeballing each other, right? And so, man, I mean, I had some fights with my brothers, but honestly, I can tell you, I never thought I'd kill him. But his brothers actually plotted to kill him. But rather than do that, thank God one of his brothers talked them out of it. And rather than kill him, they pushed him into a pit, and they decided what they were going to do, and they sold him as a slave. They sold him to some Midianite slave owners, and then that's how he ended up in Egypt. And when he came to Egypt, he was joined to a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar was the captain of Pharaoh's guard. So while he's there, he's working. He's a slave now because his brothers sold him out, completely betrayed him. And while he's in Potiphar's house, Potiphar's wife likes him. And so she decides that she's going to try to have an affair with him, have an adulterous relationship with him. But rather than give in to her seductions, he runs and she falsely accuses him of rape. So when he's 17 years old, he becomes a prisoner. Just a couple years maybe later, he ends up in Potiphar's house, and then he's thrown into prison. And he's in prison for at least 10 years for a crime he didn't commit. And he was in a house that he shouldn't have been in because his brothers sold him out and betrayed him and sold him as a slave. Not a very good picture. But at age 30, he's brought out of prison. So this is 13 years after the offense. And he stands before Pharaoh because Pharaoh has some dreams. And God tells Joseph the interpretation of the dreams. And in essence, it was this. There was going to be 7 years. The harvest was going to be great. But it was going to be followed by 7 years of severe famine. And so Joseph interprets the dream and he tells Pharaoh, here's what you need to do. During the years of famine, you need to take 1/5 of the grain. You need to store it. During the 7 years of good, store all the food that you have, 1/5 of it, so that when the famine comes, you'll have enough food to cover everything in Egypt. And that's exactly what happens. 7 years of harvest, 7 years of good years, and then 7 years of famine. And after 2 years into the severe famine, Joseph's brothers come to Egypt. So at age 30, he interprets Pharaoh's dream. He becomes second in command in all of Egypt, only behind Pharaoh. When he's 39 years old, that's 22 years after the offense, his brothers come to Egypt looking for food. And guess what they did when they came to Egypt? They bowed down in front of him. Just like Joseph had dreamed when he was 17. But the thing is, when they came and he was 30, they were 22 years later, they didn't recognize Joseph. He didn't look anything like he did when he was 17. And that's true for you too, right? I mean, you look completely different. And so Joseph is there. His brothers don't know it's him. And we studied it a few weeks ago. Rather than exact revenge on his brothers, he forgives them completely. And he tells them, look, you wanted evil in my life. You intended for evil, but God intended this for good. And he sent me before you to preserve your life. 22 years of hurt. 2 decades worth of hurt forgiven in a moment. And rather than exact revenge, Joseph actually brings his entire family to Egypt at age 39. And for 17 years, they live in Egypt, everyone together, under this umbrella of forgiveness that had been shown by Joseph. But then something happens. 17 years after they show up in Egypt, in Genesis 47:28, Joseph's father dies. Jacob passes away. So now we're talking about from 56 to 17. How many years is that? 39 years. 39 years after the offense, we're going to find ourselves back at the edge of the pit. Almost 4 decades. 4 decades later, we're going to find this offense coming up again because Jacob passed away. And I want you to read it. It's going to be in Genesis chapter 50. And we're going to begin at verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive, there's the word, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgression of the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. And notice this phrase, and Joseph wept when they spoke to him. The story of forgiveness in Joseph's life is still being written 40 years later. 4 decades after the hurt, 4 decades after the offense, and the story of forgiveness is still growing, it's still being written. If you want to know a simple definition of forgiveness, here it is. Ready? It's 3 words. Forgiving is releasing. Forgiving is releasing. Say that with me. Forgiving is, say it one more time. You got to say it with meaning. Forgiving is releasing. That is what forgiveness is. So when it was just a few years after the offense, a couple of decades, 20 years after, Joseph forgave his brothers. He released the offense. But here, now another couple decades later, now the debt is brought back to light. Joseph's father dies and his brothers are worried. And what they're worried about is maybe Joseph really didn't release the debt. Maybe Joseph really didn't forgive. Maybe the only thing that was holding him back all this time was our dad. And now that dad's out of the way, now Joseph is going to exact his revenge on us. And I love this story because I can really deeply relate to how his brothers felt. What his brothers are feeling in this moment is something that many of us who have been forgiven of something struggle with almost every day. And that is being forgiven. Have you found that it's easier to forgive someone than it is to be forgiven? Like, it's one thing if someone hurts you and you say, you know what, I release it. It's one thing to be Joseph and say, you know what, you intended evil, but I release that. But it's another thing when you're the one that hurts someone else. And they tell you, no, you know what, it's forgiven, it's released. But you're looking for something inside, some kind of assurance, some kind of feeling that this person is truly over it. And you can hear it in verse 15. The brothers said, well, maybe now that dad is dead, Joseph is going to repay us for all the evil that we did for him or to him. I think that forgiving yourself is one of the most difficult aspects of forgiveness that you have to wrestle through. Because many of us realize that the reason that we need to be forgiven for something that we have done is because of that fact, that we have done something to hurt someone else. And we describe it this way. We say, well, I know God has forgiven me, but I just can't forgive myself. You ever said that? Or have you ever said something like this? I know that my wife said that she forgave me for what I said, but I cannot believe I said that. And you feel like you got to keep making amends for the same mistake, the same offense over and over again. We might say it like this, well, my friend told me that they forgave me, but I just can't forgive myself for hurting her. Or my husband said he forgave me, but I don't feel forgiven. Or my kids tell me that they've forgiven me, but there's something about it that I just don't feel forgiven. So when we say, I can't forgive myself, here's what's happened. Someone has released us from the prison of unforgiveness. They said, look, there was an offense and I release you. And rather than walk out of that prison and live in that freedom, live in that release, we choose the shackles and we say, you know what, I'm only partially released. I'm only partially out of this because I cannot forgive myself for what I did to someone else. And that's what his brothers are really struggling with. Joseph, by his words and his action, has shown without a doubt that he had forgiven them. 22 years after the offense, rather than repaying them and nobody would have ever known that it was him, he showed them good. He brought them into Egypt. He took care of them. He took care of them for another 17 years. So for almost 2 to 3 decades, he's been taking care of his brothers, and yet here we are in Genesis chapter 50, and they're still struggling with forgiving themselves. They said it in verse 15. We did evil. We did something wrong. And Joseph's brothers found themselves in the same place that we'll find ourselves. They found themselves in a prison of unforgiveness. Joseph had completely released the debt. He had forgiven. He had released grace upon them, but they had to release it as well. Because forgiving is releasing. So why do we struggle with that? How many of you have ever struggled with being forgiven? or feeling like you can't get over it because you're the one that messed up. Anybody ever felt that way besides me? Okay, most of us have, right? I'm the one that hurt. So why is it that we struggle with that? Why do we struggle with receiving forgiveness? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons for it. Number one, we have our own struggle with forgiving other people. So because we struggle with forgiving other people, we feel like everybody is going to struggle with forgiving people. So let's take Joseph's story, for example. When Joseph was 17 years old and their dad loved him so much and the brothers were jealous because of his dreams, did they forgive Joseph? Absolutely not. Rather than forgive him, they pushed him into a pit, they sold him as a slave, and they wrote him off as dead. So because they were unforgiving people, you can see how that later on in life they think all this was a play. Now Joseph is going to have his time of revenge because that's what we did. So I think sometimes we struggle with being forgiven because we can be unforgiving as well. And we think that people are going to treat us the same way that we've treated them. It's a dog-eat-dog world, right? And because you offended someone, you ate the dog, you think, well, now they're going to come back. Now they're going to get their revenge. Now they're going to hurt me back. That's the way that the world operates. And I think that we struggle with feeling forgiven by someone, even though they told us, and even though by their actions they've shown us they've released the debt, we're struggling with feeling forgiven because we think that they're going to treat us the same way that we have treated them. When someone says something to hurt someone else, we fire back with hurtful words. That's what we do. And so we struggle with it because we think that everyone is going to do things the same way. And that's what's happening in verse 15. They said, we did evil to Joseph, and now he's going to probably repay us for the evil that we did to him. So let me give you a couple of things that you can do if you're struggling with being forgiven. Number one, I want to encourage you to take the initiative. Look at verse 16. His brothers are worried about this forgiveness. And rather than wait for Joseph to come to him, what did they do? They sent a message to Joseph. They took the initiative. And I told you this a couple of weeks ago for those who were here, that one of the greatest steps that you have to overcome in order for forgiveness to happen in your life is someone has to take the first step. Whether it's the person who offended or someone who has been offended, someone has to take the first step. I know so many couples who are so hard and bitter toward one another for 10 years, 20 years, because no one will take the first step and say, I'm sorry. No one will take the first step and say, you know what, I did wrong. Even though you did wrong, I'm the one who did wrong, and I want to apologize for what I had done. So the brothers, rather than waiting for Joseph to come to him, they took the initiative. They went to him. And if you're struggling with being forgiven, if you're struggling with feeling forgiven, take the first step. Make a phone call. Write a letter. Send an email. Shoot a text. Do something to take the first step. Don't just sit around and assume. You could see in Genesis 50, if the brothers sat there and they said, maybe Joseph is he's going to repay us for the evil. They're going to look at every action, every word through that lens, aren't they? If he says something to them sarcastically or jokingly, they're going to think, oh goodness, he's going to kill us now. And that's what happens in our lives when we don't take the initiative. Take that initiative. If you're struggling with feeling forgiven, I want to encourage you, take the initiative, take the first step. The second thing is to be honest with your sin. Look at verse 17, what they said. They said, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. Is there anything masked there? Did they say, forgive your brothers for the sin that they did, but you should have never shared the dreams? Forgive your brothers for what they did to you, but you should have never wore the coat of many colors. No. They simply acknowledged what they had done. They were honest with their sin. And then in verse 17, they asked for forgiveness. That's another thing that you should do. Take the initiative, be honest with your sin, and then ask. Say, I'm asking you to forgive me. And then in verse 18, be humble. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your what? Servants. And I think this is where it's difficult. Because to come to someone and say, I'm sorry, and then be humble, means that you put yourself at the disposal of someone else, and you can't control how they're going to react. You ever apologize to someone and they didn't react well? You ever come and said, I'm sorry for what I did? You took the initiative, you were honest with what you did, and you asked for forgiveness, and you put yourself before them and said, I'm sorry, and you humbled yourself before them, but then they responded with hurtful words, or they wrote you off and they cut you off? Here's the thing about forgiveness. Here's the thing about the prison of unforgiveness. You cannot control the words, thoughts, and actions of other people. The only person that you can control is you. And if that person that you ask forgiveness from doesn't forgive you, you can still be released from the prison. You don't have to walk around in that prison of unforgiveness. Take the initiative, be honest with the sin, confess it, go to them and ask for forgiveness, be humble when you do. And regardless of how that person responds, you do something else. You release it. You release that debt. You've done all that you can to be forgiven by that person. If they don't respond correctly, that's on them. That's not on you. You don't have to walk around that prison anymore. I have a friend of mine, he came to know Jesus much later in life. He was in his late 40s, and he came to the church where I was at the time and heard the message of the gospel, and I met with him for lunch on Monday. And when I met with him, I mean, this guy he's a successful businessman, has a family, has grown children. I mean, just much later on in his life, very established in his career. And I met with him at lunch up here at Tortugas. I don't think they're open anymore, on 45. And at lunch, he was just weeping. Just tears running down his face over the gospel that he had heard. He had been raised in church all of his life and had gone to a Catholic church. He said, I've never heard that forgiveness can be found by faith in Jesus. I felt like he had to earn it, and we talked a lot about that. And he said, but when I look at my life and I look at my past, he said, man, I've dealt with alcoholism, I've dealt with different things, and I've been unfaithful and all these different things. And he just was confessing all the things that he had done. But the gospel came in and transformed his life, and he made a statement. He said, a friend of mine told me something years ago that really came to light yesterday when you were preaching. And the statement was this: I've given up hope on a better past. And man, when he said that, I thought, that's so good. That many of us are in prison because of our past. Someone holds unforgiveness, we need forgiveness from someone else, and we keep staying in the prison of that unforgiveness from the past. You cannot go undo anything in the past. The brothers in Joseph's story could not go back to the pit, rewind time, bring him out of the pit, and make a different life for themselves. That's not the way life works. But from this time forward, you can make a better future by refusing to live in that prison of unforgiveness. You have to release the actions of other people. Some may not forgive you. You might be humble. You might take the initiative. You might be honest with your sin. You may ask them for forgiveness. And some people aren't going to do it. They're not going to forgive you. Others will. But you're not responsible for them. You're responsible for you. So last fall, I wrote an email to a friend of mine asking for forgiveness. God had been dealing with me about something in my life, and so I wrote him an email. And I took a long time. I really prayed through what I wanted to write, and so I wrote to this person. I just said, there were some things that happened that I did not intend to happen. I just want to say I'm sorry for that. I apologize for what I did. And man, if I read the email that I got back here, you would think, oh my goodness, what in the world is wrong with this person? The response I got back was one of unforgiveness, saying, you've done me wrong, you did this, recounted all the sins, and absolutely did not extend forgiveness. And in the email called me the name of a biblical character that if you knew the character, you'd think, oh my goodness, he's basically placed me in the pits of hell in his mind. And I read that email, man, and I felt so bad about the response. But I realized in that moment, you know what? I've done everything I can to make this right. But if this person will not forgive me, that's on them. But in that moment, God gave me release from that debt. And that's what you have to do. You can't judge it based on the other person's reaction. You do all that you can, and then you release it to God. And you say, God, I want you to be God. You bring about the good. You bring about what is right, and let God control the consequences of the offense and sin in your life. One of my favorite passages is Psalm 103. It'll be on the screen. It says, for as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is His steadfast love toward those who fear Him. Listen to this. For as far as the east is from the west, so far does He remove our transgressions from us. Think about that for a moment. God didn't say that God removes our sin from us as far as the north is from the south, because if you started in Texas and you went north through Canada and then you went up to the North Pole, eventually you'd start heading where? South. But if you start in Houston, Texas, and you start going east, and you get over into Europe, and then you get to Asia, and then you get back to Hawaii, and then you get back to Houston, did you ever go west? No, you kept going east. So east is east and west is west, and never the two shall meet, right? You remember that from high school English? Anybody? They use twain, but anyway, sorry about that. Sorry I changed the old English. That's the idea, that as far as the east is from the west, they will never meet each other. That's how far God has removed the sin from you. When you go to God and you ask for forgiveness, God says it is released completely. And then notice this last part. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. For he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. There are going to be times in your life, you just need to know this. You're going to hurt people. You're going to sin. There are going to be times when you're going to say something that you didn't mean to say, that you didn't want to say. There are going to be times when you're going to do something that you didn't want to happen. But God forgives that debt. And we have to rest in that release. And we have to release that debt to God. We have to be honest. We have to take it to Him, let Him forgive us. And if we have to go to this person and say, I need to confess this, I need you to forgive me. And regardless of how that person responds, you leave it in the hands of God. And God says, if we confess our sins, He's faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Here's the thing about your past offenses. I really hope this will help you. Paralyzing shame is not from God. It's likely that there are things and offenses in your life that you have done, that you have committed, that if we played them up here on the screen, you would be so humiliated and ashamed of what you've done. I've got them. It's likely that you have them as well. Once we give that to God, it is released. And when that shame in your life is coming back to where your relationships are hindered and you're paralyzed, that is not from God. That is Satan wanting to constantly bring up your past and tell you that you're a horrible person. No Christian would ever act this way, and that is not the voice of God. Paralyzing shame is not from God. What these brothers of Joseph are feeling in this story, that's not from God. Joseph had released the debt. It was forgiven. He had released grace upon them. But they were paralyzed because of their own shame and what they had done. And that is not from God. If you have confessed that sin, it is released as far as the east is from the west. Because forgiving is releasing. So when you need to be forgiven, take the initiative. Be honest with your sin. Be humble. Ask for forgiveness. And then release it. Release it to God and let God be in control of the consequences. But there's another person in this story I'd like to focus on just for a few moments. And that person is Joseph. So you have the brothers dealing with unforgiveness, feeling unforgiven. And then you have Joseph. I want to read verse 19. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? Now here's the way it happens. When someone hurts you, don't you want to be God? Like, don't you want to kind of give them what they've got coming? Whether it's just a smack in the face or a hurtful word, whatever it is. You want to beat somebody down? Don't judge me. You know you've thought it. You're looking, well, not me. I love Jesus. I'm like, don't try it. I've been around you, all right? Right? You know that that's true. That a person hurt you and you want to play God to them. But when you're the one that offended someone else, you don't want God giving you what you deserve, do you? That's where you need grace and forgiveness. And Joseph responds to his brothers and he says, you don't need to be fearful. I'm not God. You can hear that Joseph has released that offense to God. He gives it to God, and yes, what his brothers did was wrong. They betrayed their brother. They sold him as a slave. It should have never happened. But Joseph said, I'm not going to bring about the consequences for your sin. I'm going to release those things to God. I am not in God's place. And if you're going to forgive someone, you need to know that. If you're going to forgive someone, you can't play God. This is not the Wild West where you go take God's law into your own hands. You have to release it to God and say, God, you got to deal with this the way that you see fit. And you may not like the way God deals with it. You may not like the way that God handles it, but we have to release it to Him. Then in verse 20, as for you You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." So Joseph reminds his brothers of the past, and I hope that liberates you. Did Joseph forgive his brothers? Answer out loud. Did he forgive them? Yeah. He said he forgave them 22 years after the offense, and then he showed him with his actions. He brought them into Egypt and he took care of them. He forgave them completely for what happened. But did Joseph remember what happened? Yeah. He said, "As for you, this is what you did. This is what you wanted to do." But here's what God brought about. Here's what God was doing in the midst of that offense. Forgiving is releasing. Forgiving is not forgetting. Don't get them confused. Now, just because you remember something doesn't mean that you have to constantly bring it up to the person. But the fact that you remember an offense, that doesn't make you unforgiving. It just makes you human. You just remember it. But that doesn't mean that you have to be a prisoner to it. The key to unlocking that prison is whether or not you forgive the offense. So in verse 20, he says to them, "I'm going to release the past to God. You wanted this is what God wanted." And he trusted God. And notice in the last part of verse 17, to go back up, that when Joseph's brothers went to him and they said, "Forgive us for what we had done," the Bible says at the end of verse 17 that Joseph wept when he heard them. And I wonder, why was Joseph weeping? Was it because he couldn't believe that his brothers didn't believe his forgiveness? Or was it that in hearing his brother's confession again, it brought him back to that hurt? It brought him back to that moment of betrayal. And he felt the things that he felt when he was a 17-year-old kid when his brothers pushed him in a pit and sold him as a slave. It could be any of those things. And you need to know this about forgiveness. Forgiveness is painful. Forgiveness is tough. I've told you throughout this series, forgiveness is messy. And you're going to feel the hurt again. There are going to be times when you're going to go back to that pit. You're here in Genesis 50. Joseph is back in the pit. His brothers are confessing, and he's having to bring back to memory the things that happened to him. And it hurt. It was painful. But in the end, it's a beautiful picture of Jesus when you can forgive by releasing. And that's exactly what Joseph did in his life. Releasing debt, releasing the offense, involves you trusting God. That God is going to take the past hurts of your life and He's going to bring about something good from it. I think of the little girl that my family and I are going to be adopting. And she's 3.5 years old if the Chinese government approves this daughter. And as I pray for her every night, I pray for this little girl that's going to be coming into our family. She's had 3.5, and by the time we get her, almost 4 years of rejection by her biological parents. Now, maybe some of it was because of circumstances that were beyond their control, and we don't know the whole backstory. But here's a young lady that's going to come with hurts and offenses in her life that it may take her the rest of her life to deal with. What we want to do as parents is we want to be examples of what it means to forgive, and by the grace of God move forward and release it. And trust that God in some way is going to bring about the good that He wants. Maybe this little girl is adopted by us and we raise her to honor God with her life, and maybe God would send her back to China as a missionary to orphan kids. That's something I've just prayed and said, God, if that's what you want, God, that's what we want. Or maybe God would raise this girl up to marry a godly businessman, and then with their money and with their resources, they just give to help people in need. Whatever it is, in some way God can take her story of hurt and offenses and bring a beautiful story of His forgiveness and releasing that debt so that God can bring about the good. Then in verse 21, notice this. Rather than say to him, don't fear, I'm not in the place of God, but you're going to get what's coming. Notice what he says to his brothers in verse 21. Do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Don't worry, brothers. I'm going to keep showing you grace. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to look after you. You pushed me into the pit. You intended evil, but God had something else in mind. And in Joseph's life, don't you see Jesus on the cross? Seriously. I mean, can't you just see grace flowing out of Joseph to bless other people? Don't you just see the same words of Jesus that he uttered from the cross? Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. You had no idea what you were doing. You wanted evil, but God had something else in mind. When we forgive, we paint a picture of Jesus for everyone who sees and reads our story to hear and to enjoy. Forgiving someone else is oftentimes releasing that debt over and over and over again. Here's Joseph. Joseph is 40 years after the offense, 40 years later, and he's having to release the debt all over again. And no doubt, there'll be many times more in his life where he'll have to release that debt. And it'll be the same for you. You may forgive someone, and you send that ship out to the ocean, and you say, I release it, it goes away, and all of a sudden it comes back to dock. And then you have to face that offense again, you have to take it to the cross, and you have to release it over and over again. There have been offenses in my life that happened when I was a kid that many times in my life I've had to release over and over again. But in that we see Jesus. When you put your faith in Jesus and Jesus saved you from your sins, you sinned again, didn't you? I know I did. And yet Jesus keeps forgiving. He keeps forgiving. And many of you have probably done the same sin over and over again after a believer in Jesus. And you've come back to the Lord and said, I'm sorry, Lord, for what I've done. I ask for forgiveness. And Jesus releases it as far as the east is from the west. If we confess our sins, He's faithful and just, means He always does it. Faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. A few years ago, I read a story. I hope I didn't run. Oh, Donna, I need your unlock. Oh, it doesn't. Good. Okay, good. I had to, my kids aren't here today because Luke is sick, and they normally bring my iPad because they have to play it in the morning, or they'll drive my wife crazy, so I had to borrow Donna's. But a few years ago, in 2011, I saw a story on the news, and many of you may remember it in Houston. Remember the story of the young lady named Jessica Tata? She was a child care provider. She watched kids in her home. And on the news that night, they had the cameras flying overhead as the house was burning and there were children inside. And I was intrigued by that. I was a former firefighter, but more than that, I was a dad. And they knew on the scene that some of the kids inside of that daycare center had been killed. They had died from the fire. And as the story came out, as more details emerged, what happened was Jessica had, I forget how many kids she had at the house, but she put the kids down for a nap, and then she left the children unattended and drove to Target to pick up juice and snacks for the kids, and she left a pot of burning oil on the stove, and it caught the house on fire. So I could not believe it, and of course you can imagine the emotion, just the sheer horror of that scene. So a few days later in the Chronicle, they wrote a story, and they wrote an article on the story, and I'd like to read just an excerpt of that. And I remember when I read the Chronicle that morning, I was appalled by the story, but I was amazed by the last statement of the article. So I don't normally like to read something that's too long, but if you'll just give me a moment, I think that it'll make the point. Emmanuel Cajo woke at 4:30 a.m. and slipped out of bed, leaving his wife to sleep a bit longer. A nurse, Emmanuel had agreed to pick up an extra shift at St. Joseph Medical Center that morning, and that meant their baby girl, Elizabeth, would go to daycare instead of spending the day with Daddy. In the kitchen, he poured fresh whole milk into a baby bottle, then he climbed the stairs to the girl's bedroom. Careful not to awaken 5-year-old Joan, Emmanuel walked quietly to the crib. He lifted Elizabeth, sweet and sleepy in her pajamas, slipped her pacifier from her mouth, and replaced it with the bottle. Elizabeth, 19 months, was just learning to talk. Her first and favorite word was Dada. And she would sing to him, and the one word, it would just grow. Dada, Dada, Dada. Emmanuel's wife sometimes teased him, and she would say, "She loves you too much." When Elizabeth finished the milk, Emmanuel changed her diaper and dressed her in a pair of bright pink leggings and a rosy blouse. She gave him a hug, a strong hug from such tiny arms, he thought. She still looked sleepy, so he laid her back in the crib. And less than 12 hours later, he would stand over Elizabeth again. But this time, she was lying on a hospital bed, and he touched her little hand, but this time it was cold. Then the article describes the fire and what happened with Jessica Tata leaving the house, and two kids from across the street saw the fire and they tried to enter the home, and they actually had burn marks on their arm and smoke inhalation trying to get in, and it was just too much. Firefighters came in and they rescued some of the children, and so I'll spare the details of that. But then it describes the story of the mom on that day. Betty's third grade students at Briar Meadow Charter School were logged into a math computer program when her cell phone rang about 1:40 p.m. She normally doesn't answer it during class, but the daycare came up on her caller ID. "You've got to get here quickly," Jessica screamed. "All the babies are dying." And then the phone went dead. Betty told her students to keep doing their work and ran down the hall to the school principal's office. Principal Peter Hines heard Betty screaming before he saw her. My baby, my babysitter called and the children are dying at the daycare." The principal grabbed her by the hand and steered her toward the door. "Let's go, and let's go find your baby." In his car, Betty's cell phone rang again. It was her husband, Emmanuel, returning her panicked message. "All their children are dying? This has to be an exaggeration," he said. Still, he was frightened, and she asked him to pray for their baby. The principal dropped Betty off at Southwest Memorial Hermann. In the ER, Betty again was told that she would not be given any information until all the children were identified. "So bring out the clothes," she said. And there they were, the little pink leggings and a rosy blouse. Her babies. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the nurse said. "We did everything that we could." She screamed and collapsed in the hallway, and the principal knelt and held her. He took her cell phone and called Emmanuel, and Emmanuel heard Betty screaming, and he knew the truth. "Just get here," the principal said. While Emmanuel drove to the hospital, the nurse let Betty in to see Elizabeth. There was a police officer in the room. He said that she could touch Elizabeth's hand, but she could not hold her. The principal and the officer stood against the wall, both crying, and a chaplain held Betty's hand. "My baby," she said, "my baby. I cannot bury this baby. I just can't." Emmanuel arrived and wrapped his wife in a hug. The article goes on to talk about that a few days later, Jessica Tata ran. The details began to emerge about what had happened in the fire, and she fled the country, and she was arrested weeks later. And this is the end of the article. Emmanuel, 41, awoke to an empty bed around 7 a.m. the day after the fire. He climbed the stairs to the girls' room and searched for his wife. And Emmanuel found Betty lying on Joan's bed holding a light pink outfit that Elizabeth had worn. It had a little matching jacket with a round collar. Betty hadn't had a chance to wash it, and so it still smelled like her baby, of baby lotion and of baby drool. Emmanuel brought his wife downstairs away from the tiny pink outfit and the empty crib to their bedroom. And there they cried and they prayed and they began to talk. Nigerian immigrants with a strong Christian faith, they reasoned that God had saved many people that day from the fire, and God could have saved Elizabeth. And Betty said Elizabeth was so sweet and so loving. She would share anything with anyone, even her beloved pacifier, and she would not want her parents to be angry or vengeful. And after hours of talking and praying, they decided to do what felt impossible, and they forgave Jessica Tata. And that's how the article ends. And I read that article for the first time, and I cried pretty much the way I have today, probably worse. I've read that article many times. And as I read that article and I read that last statement, the first thought that came to my mind was, I wonder how many people are going to read the Chronicle today. And however many subscribers they have, they're all going to hear that statement. That these parents were able to do something that's completely incomprehensible. something that defies what any normal person would be able to do and feel. They were going to forgive the woman who was responsible for their sweet 19-month-old daughter's death. And what was cited in the article was their faith, their Christian faith, compelled them to do it. I don't know if anyone was redeemed from that article. I don't know that anyone would have read that and then understood who Jesus was, but here's what I know. By their act of forgiveness, they have put on display Jesus on the cross. And in doing that, people can find the forgiveness that every soul needs, the forgiveness for their sins. So I pray that you, no matter what the offense, no matter how many years it's been since the offense, would find the power to forgive, and you'd find it in the power of the cross. Will you join me in prayer?